Hello and welcome to this two-part review where we're going to be taking a look at two games across two videos in 2 days. In this first video, as the title would suggest, we're going to be taking a look at a game called 140, and then tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at a game called Thoth. The reason that I want to take a look at these games now is because they've recently come out on the Nintendo Switch, and I sort of see them as being a part of the same package, despite being quite different in terms of gameplay. So, let's kick off the video with some background information. 140 and Thoth were both developed by Jeppe Carlsen. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, under the banner of Carlsen Games. However, the vast bulk of work put into these games seems to have been done by Jeppe on his own, with outside help being brought in for the music and the art. This means these games are about as indie as it gets, and because of that, they aren't afraid to get a bit experimental. Jeppe Carlsen previously worked for a company called Playdead as the gameplay director and gameplay designer, and if you're unfamiliar with this company, I urge you to become familiar with them because they've created two of my favourite games ever made, these being Limbo and INSIDE. I seriously don't have high enough praise for both of these games, and if you haven't already, you need to check them out. So with 140 and Thoth being made by someone who worked at Playdead and had a hand in the creation of these two games, we know we're in good hands here. So enough chit chat and let's talk about the actual game, shall we? As soon as you turn it on, it smacks you right in the face with its awesome electronic vibes and sets up the type of game it is immediately with its simplistic title design and its bright colours. "140 is in its simplest form a 2D platformer. However, it falls into quite a niche subgenre called the minimalist platformer, which is defined by having extremely minimalistic design and visuals. 140 has no menus, it has extremely simple graphics, mostly consisting of basic coloured shapes. There's only two control functions, one being movement and the other being jumping, and there's not really any enemies per se within the standard levels. This automatically might make you think the game would be boring or maybe a bit too simple. However, this is where the genius level design that Jeppe Carlsen is capable of, as well as the amazing electronic soundtrack created by Jacob Schmid, comes into play. What really sells 140 as an experience is in the quite unique way in which the music and sound effects in the game all affect elements of the environment around you. And progression through the levels involves you collecting coloured circles and bringing them to platforms, which then add more layers to the music, which in turn activates new parts of the world around you and enables you to move forward in ways you couldn't before. With all of these new elements being added with each bit of progression you make through the game's 4 levels, you can imagine things becoming pretty chaotic when these gameplay elements start to be used in conjunction with each other, and you'd be right to imagine that. This game is pretty difficult, and you'll need to have good rhythm and timing to be able to get through some of the obstacles presented. Having said that though, the game is never overwhelming or unfair, even when it's at its most difficult. It always introduces new gameplay mechanics one at a time and allows you to get a feel for them. Like for example, these squares filled with TV static that instantly kills you, that move up and down, or these squares that change in size to the beat of the music but can't be touched while in the process of changing. But then later on it will combine these elements into a more difficult section, but because you've already seen both of the elements here, it's not overwhelming. This is straight up great game design, but what elevates this game further is the huge variety of different obstacles you'll be coming across. Like these squares appearing in a line creating bridges and platforms before disappearing, static blocks which alternate being active and inactive with other blocks, anti-gravity being activated and deactivated, elevators moving up and down, moving instant death blocks, squares that change position when you touch them, trampolines that bounce you up into the air before turning into static, and way more. And remember that every single thing moving in this game is all a part of the music. So as the levels become more complex, the music is ramping up and becoming more intense, creating this effect where you almost zone out and are playing the game purely on instinct. It definitely won't be coming across in this video how much of a weirdly visceral experience this game is to go through. So if based on what you're seeing you think you might like this, you should try it out for yourself. However, there's actually more to the game than just the platforming. Before we move on to that though, has anyone else noticed that the level design at the end of level 2 with the anti-gravity feels really oddly similar to the ending section of Limbo? There's nothing wrong with that or anything, I just think it's a nice little reference to the previous game that Jeppe Carlsen had worked on at the time, and it didn't go unnoticed. So let me tell you about one of the main things that I love about 140, which for me adds so much to the experience. Remember me saying the game didn't have enemies? Technically it does, but in the form of boss battles which appear at the end of every level. Well, I say appear, the game just sort of transitions into them with no breaking gameplay and no loading or anything, which is an awesome detail. In fact, the game launches with no visible loading at all, and I've never known a Switch game to do that. It's pretty much instant. The transitions into the boss fights and from the fights into the little hub area where you select levels are amazing and create this really odd atmosphere because you go from these hectic levels to the really intense boss fights and then to the silence of the hub world, and it suddenly feels really empty and lonely. I'm not sure if there's some meaning to be drawn from this, or indeed if there's any meaning to be drawn from the game as a whole, but there's these elements that almost make it feel like there is something more to this game. But anyway, I just got sidetracked. The boss battles in 140 are all really weird, changing the genre of the game into something else entirely, which makes the game feel really varied and gives you a nice reward for finishing the levels because you get to see what the game will throw at you next. The first boss turns the game into a Space Invader style shooter where you automatically fire based on the beat of the music, forcing you to position yourself ahead of the enemy because you can't manually shoot. The second boss is a Galaga style obstacle course where it feels like you're flying towards the top of the screen and you're having to avoid static squares which are appearing behind and in front of you. The third boss turns into a sort of rhythm game where you need to shoot triangles away that are pointing towards you. But the twist here is that not only do you shoot to the beat of the music, but you'll also be rotated to the beat of the music, forcing you to really concentrate and think ahead and take the rotation into consideration. Then on top of that, the final phase of the fight has the entire screen rotate at the same time you're also rotating, and it can really mess with your head. This is by far the hardest part of the entire game, but it's also so satisfying to get through. The fourth boss fight is a sort of harder version of the first boss, only this time involving anti-gravity, but because of the inclusion of that, it still feels different enough to the original boss. It's amazing stuff, and these are some of the weirdest platformer bosses I've ever seen. It's almost worth playing just to see these. Adding to the value of the Switch version specifically is the fact that you can play the fourth level and fight the fourth boss at all, because previously this level and boss had been exclusive to the PC version of the game, with it being added as free DLC. So this makes the Switch version the only console version to have this extra content. I'm giving 140 a 9 out of 10. Honestly, there's pretty much nothing it does wrong. The only reason I'm not giving it a full 10 is because it is a little bit short. However, the length of time you'll have with the game will change depending on your skill level. Plus, another minor criticism is that it doesn't have much replay value. Don't get me wrong though, it does have a bit, because after finishing the 4 main levels, you unlock a hard mode where you then have to complete each of the levels and their bosses without dying a single time. And plus, the levels themselves are mirrored too. But this isn't really enough to keep you going for a long time. What would have been a cool inclusion would have been a boss rush mode, or maybe some form of multiplayer, or maybe even a level editor. However, this was a game made primarily by a single person, so I feel like I'm being a bit nitpicky asking for that stuff. Other than that though, the game perfectly nails everything it sets out to do. Despite being minimal in its presentation, it's amazing to look at. Having bright colours that constantly shift with each collectible you pick up, and nice moving backgrounds which mimic the way a sound wave would look. And the details like this stop the game looking boring while still being minimal. The controls are basic but perfectly functional and fit in with the game's theme of minimalism. The music is amazing, and with it being such a huge focus of the game, this is essential because a bad soundtrack could have ruined the entire thing. The level design is interesting and unique, the bosses inject variety into the gameplay, and it's just a masterfully crafted game. What more can I say? And that's 140. I definitely wouldn't say that this is for everybody because it's quite arty and abstract, but if you're into that sort of thing, like me, then it's a definite must play. Plus, it's only £4.50 on the Nintendo Switch store, so you really can't go wrong here. The question is though, how on earth do you follow a game like 140 up? Well, join me in tomorrow's video, where we'll be taking a look at Jeppe Carlsen's second game, Thoth. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more stuff in the future, and I'll see you next time. Bye!